Hello solar folks, my name is Jeremy Allen, Solar Design Tech here at Wholesale Solar. Today we're here to discuss one of the most important parts of your solar array, the solar racking system. We're going to go over the installation of the Iron Ridge XR100 racking system on an asphalt composition roof using the FlashFoot 2 flashings. There are many other types of roof. This is the most common, but if you have a tile or metal roof, don't be afraid, we do have a solution for you. We choose to work with the Iron Ridge racking system because of its ease of installation, code compliancy, and included state-stamped engineering that will include your wind and snow load requirements specific to your state. Before we jump on the roof, be sure to have all of your tools prepared, your parts laid out, and the engineering report that we've provided you with so that you know how to lay out the panels on the rooftop. Do want to make sure each one of you is being safe up there. You can get a fall protection kit from your local hardware store or roofing supply store to make sure you're extra safe. With that said, let's get started. One of the pieces of information that is not included on your engineering report is the distance between the rails up on the roof. That's going to be dictated by the holes that are pre-drilled on your specific panel. In this case, we've got a solar panel here, about 100 watts. Its holes are going to be 35.5 inches apart. That means their rails on the roof are going to be 35.5 inches apart. To get started, we need to find out where our rafter or truss is within this rooftop. Now keep in mind, some local authority having jurisdiction or your local building department may require you to have full 3 feet or more from the edge of the roof. In our case, we don't have that much roof, so we're going to go right up to the edge of it. Where we're going to want to start out is finding nails, if we can, in the fascia or on that nice pretty board that goes along the bottom of your rooftop. In this case, we can see a couple nails, and we know generally that that truss is going to be located somewhere in this area. We don't need to know that exact space yet because we're going to drill a spot hole through the roof and into the attic so we can measure exactly where that is. The other figure we want to keep in mind is the 35.5 inches that we discussed earlier. In this case, we'll see doesn't line up exactly with the center of our shingles, which we'd really like to. And as long as we're within 2 to 3 inches of those pre-drilled mounting holes on the back of the solar panel, we're okay. So we're going to know, we're going to go in the center of this shingle length right here, the center of this shingle length right here. So first thing we're going to want to do, we're going to want to get our drill, and we're going to want to drill right close to this to see how close we actually are to that rafter. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to put a pilot hole in here. And again, we found our truss location somewhere in here, and we know we've got to be somewhat centered on this course of shingles. So we're going to go ahead and put a hole right here and see where we come out in the attic. Now we can leave the drill bit in place so that we can go into the attic and find out where we are in comparison to that truss. At this point, we're going to come into the attic space and measure from the center of our drill bit to the edge of our truss to find out exactly how far we have to move over. And we see we've got about 1 5/8 inches. We've got to add another 3/4 of an inch to that to be sure we're centered inside of the truss. So let's go ahead and go back up on the roof and make that happen. All right, so we know we're 1 5/8 from the center of this drill bit to the edge of the truss here. So we're actually going to mark out that exact measurement and know, okay, we've got the edge of our truss. Now from there, because all of our standard lumber is going to be about 1.5 inches, we want to measure 3/4 of an inch from that point to the center of what's now going to be our new hole. Now you're asking, you got a hole in your roof, what are you going to do about that? We actually will just use a standard sealant, something like Henry's or whatever your roof specific manufacturer requires, and put it into this hole to make sure it stays watertight. And essentially that flashing is going to go over that hole to make sure it stays weatherproof and watertight anyway. So from this step, we'll go ahead and remove our drill bit. So now that we have our center mark here, we're going to make another center mark for the next one up. Again, 35.5 inches from the bottom hole. So we're going to go ahead and measure. In this case, we know we've got a good square structure. May not always be that way, so there may be a couple trips into the attic to spot holes to be sure you're hitting the center of your truss. But in this case, we'll go ahead and move along, and we'll find out we're about 27 3/8 of an inch from the edge of the roof. Now I'm going to take that same measurement up to this course of shingles. We're going to go 27 3/8 inches up here, and no, we've got a line now that we can take with our chalk and make a good visible line for future holes that we're going to be drilling. Now, if you have multiple panels high or multiple panels wide, you'll just do this that many more times to be sure you have all the holes lined out before you actually start drilling. So we've got a good chalk block, and we're actually going to get in here. We're going to chalk out a line on here so everyone can see exactly where we're going to be drilling. And pretty simple. Now, from here again, as long as the framing's standard, you should have about a 24-inch center-to-center line. Your trusses, typically you're 24 inches from each other, but again, that's not going to always be the case, so you'll want to double check. We're going to go ahead and pull the tape measure 24 inches over, and no, that should be the next truss. So now we have our two trusses marked out where we're actually going to be drilling into the roof. The other thing that we need to do is actually get that line lined up here where our rails are actually going to be sitting. So we're going to take a measurement from the bottom of the roof to the center of this, or if you really trust your roofer and know that they made straight lines to begin with, a lot of times you can follow their course of shingles and know you should be really close. So if we did that right, we'll know these will be our first two real holes that will hold the flashings in place. So we're going to go ahead and drill in. Now that we have all of our holes drilled, we're going to get up underneath each course of shingles to make sure that our flashing has a good place to slide up and seat itself. So we're going to take our flat bar and we're going to slide it up under here and look for any resistance where there might be actually nails popping up, and we're going to try and remove them. Sometimes you're going to get lucky, which in this case it looks like we may have with this flashing, where there's not going to be any nails that would obstruct that flashing. Other places, you might find out there's going to be a couple nails, and you're going to have to remove those and possibly replace them if need be to keep those shingles in place. Before we put the flashing in place, we are going to put the appropriate sealant in the holes to make sure our roof remains watertight. In this case, we've got some good old Henrys. We're going to fill that hole up completely, knowing that the flashing is still going to cover this hole and keep it even further weather tight. Get a good amount in there. Make sure it's good coverage, and if you need to, go through on the other side into the attic to make sure that did fill that hole completely. Now, we're going to go ahead and put our flashing in place, lag it down into the hole that we drilled already, and go from there. We're going to slide this flashing up under that course of shingles, knowing we don't have any nails up there. These center lines, there's actually little punches in the flashing to line you up. If you've got a chalk line going the length of your roof, which you will in longer solar arrays, you can line up these little notches right with those chalk lines, and it'll center you right to where that hole should be. Now in this case, we know we're close to that hole, and we're going to go ahead and start threading our bolt in place. Make sure that we don't have anything in that hole. You can use an air compressor to clean out the hole if you need to. And then just a basic ratchet, and we're going to tighten that guy up until it starts to seat all the way to the roof. Now we don't want to over tighten to where it's concaving that flashing. You can actually cause issues in doing so. And again, we don't want to get too tight. We just want to seat firmly against the rooftop, and you'll feel it I don't recommend doing this with a power tool because you will over tighten them and you can ruin the flashings or break the bolt just from the excess heat going into the truss. And so we're fully seated there. We actually have a cap that's now going to go on the top of this that's going to connect it to the rail that we're putting in place. This is the proprietary piece that Iron Ridge has come up with to make their flashings this easy to install. As you see, the bolt is raised off of the roof surface so that if water does come through here, even without this cap being on there, there's no way of that water actually getting down into the rooftop. So we take this piece here, and it's going to go in place, and it can have two different locations. It's either going to be up and down like that, which we actually don't want that. We want to go back 1/4 of a turn and lock it so that the rail will sit right across it like this. All right, our last little guy here, and we're ready to move on to the rail install. All right, so the next portion of this installation is going to be the actual rails being attached to these flashings. Each setup's going to have some different amounts of hardware that we're going to have to look at before we put the rail in place. In this case, we've got it simple because we only have 2 attachments from the rail to the flashings, and we're going to use the supplied hardware that's actually going to be a square on one end and a regular nut on the other end. That square end's going to slide down the rail channel all the way to the one side. We'll get both of those in there so we have them in place, and we can even line them up close to where the flashings are if you've got the rail sitting on the rooftop like this. A lot of cases I am going to suggest to get that rail ready ahead of time down on the ground if possible. In this case, we'll loosen up these nuts enough to where they slide right over these flashings. So in this case, we're actually going to mount this rail with the non-hardware side facing down towards the ground so that you don't see any of that hardware if you're looking up at the array. So we're going to spin it around. We're going to line it up with those flashings, and we're going to drop it right down over the top of these. We're going to keep it loose for now, just hand tight, until we get the other rail in place to make sure that they actually line up. We're going to want to measure from a common point on the roof, in this case the edge of the roof, to make sure that these rails are flush. In a lot of cases you could actually cut the rails up on the roof. However, I don't suggest doing that just because of the metal shards that you'll have all over your rooftop, and because you could damage the panels if they're already mounted on top of these rails. So we're going to go ahead and measure, and then we'll tighten everything down. And then we'll hand tighten as we go through, making sure that the elevation of the rail is where you want it to be. Now, some rooftops aren't completely flat, so because of that, Iron Ridge's flashings do have an elevation adjustment so that you can make sure that rail itself does remain flat and consistent through the whole array. Now, there are going to be torque specs on each one of these. If you are using a torque wrench, make sure that you are using a very high quality torque wrench. If you over torque these bolts, they will break. All right, so now we have our basic rail installation in place. Now it's time to actually dress these rails with the appropriate wire management and install any microinverters or optimizers that we may have as part of the system. First thing we're going to do is install these end caps. Iron Ridge provides these end caps for their rails to be sure that no bees or bugs or anything gets inside of the rails, and it's also a good way to make everything look pretty good. So we're just going to snap these in place. This is assuming that your rails are cut to length, which, like I said before, you should have them cut to length before getting them up on the roof. It's always good to double check because once you do cut, you can't go back. Now that we have those end caps in place, we'll place some wire management clips on the top rail or on the rail that's going to be closest to where your wires are going to be located, either for the PV modules themselves or for possible optimizers or microinverters that could be part of the installation. So typically you're going to get 3 of these clips per module, and you'll want to just slide them right on top of the rail, close to where they may be. They're fully adjustable, so once we get the solar panels up here and ready to install, we'll adjust them accordingly to make sure they're in the correct place. So one of the most important parts of getting the whole rail system prepared is making sure we're properly grounded. Now the Iron Ridge system makes this grounding method very simple by adding 1 ground bolt to each solar array. Now this 1 ground bolt attaches to your bare copper wire, goes down to your ground rod that's already existing, and this 1 ground lug is actually going to go through the whole system because their whole rail system is integrated, which means each piece and part has little teeth on it that bonds everything together to be sure you don't have to individually ground each PV module. So this little guy right here, we're going to go ahead and install on either rail, whatever's closest to your grounding mechanism. That's what we're going to use. In this case, we're going to set it on top of the rail just for ease of installation and so that you can see what we're actually doing. Now in your individual installation, you may choose to actually hide this up underneath the solar panel. That's not a problem. As long as it's properly grounded, you'll be safe. Part of dressing our rails is going to be installing any microinverters or solar optimizers that we may have as part of our installation. These guys, in this case, this is a SolarEdge power optimizer, which will come included with all of our SolarEdge systems. This will be attached on each solar panel and then attached to each other, then down to the inverter to carry the DC current. So what we're going to do is we're going to try and center this right underneath where that solar panel is going to sit so that everything has easy access to plug into each other. So again, we have a simple piece of hardware, just a T-bolt with a nut, and again, same grounding mechanism built into it with the little teeth that are going to bond this unit to the rail. Now these are a T-bolt, so you will want to make sure that they are positively seated inside this channel and that the T is turned completely. You'll know that that T is turned correctly by the little hash mark in the top of that bolt being opposite of the rail itself. So in this case, we're going up and down with that little hash mark where our rail is going side to side. So in this case, we have our optimizer put in place right where we're going to want it underneath that solar panel, and we can use the wire management that we have in place to set the cables up underneath here, and they clip so they hold it. Now we know that we're going to do some adjusting with our wires, and in this case actually not have an optimizer for our system, but I did want to show you what all was entailed with that installation and how you would appropriately use this wire management system. What we have here is the UFO system by Iron Ridge. This is a mid clamp which will actually be used throughout the whole system, and with the addition of the stopper sleeve, this will turn into an end clamp. We'll just simply push the 2 pieces together, snap them together, and that now is an end clamp that will hold the end of the panels in the array together, whereas the single piece by itself will separate the panels in the center. Now we're going to move on to the actual installation of the solar panel using the Iron Ridge UFO clamps. We'll have these end clamps on the end of the rail. We'll have the mid clamps between the solar panels that we're actually installing. Now, I generally recommend that you have a few hands doing this at least. You will be dealing with a 50 to 60 pound solar panel, and they're not very easy to hold in place while you're bolting. In this case, we've got a really lightweight solar panel for this project just to make it really easy. Now we'll go ahead and lay this solar panel down. We're going to make sure that we're going over the top of our wire management, and in the case that we do have an optimizer or a microinverter, we want to make sure that we're not pinching it in any way, that this panel is sitting flush down on the rails with those mounting holes within 2 to 3 inches, again, of the rail itself. So we'll go ahead and we're going to take the mid clamp, the part that doesn't have the sleeve. We're actually going to set it up here. This is going to be between two solar panels, and you're going to end up having a number of these if you have a longer array. These will sit in place okay. They're just a little T-bolt on the end. So again, they're going to go into the channel, turn, and lock in place. The end clamp, again with that sleeve, is what's going on the end of the panel. That sleeve makes sure that nothing tightens down too much that it won't be able to hold this panel in place. Once we have these up here, we are going to go ahead and tighten down our end clamps. Not all the way, but just enough to assist in holding the panel. And again, you do want to make sure you have positive pressure on that T-bolt to make sure it doesn't spin within the channel. Same thing on the bottom, and of course, now we want to make sure, again, our measurements are really similar with the rails from the edge of the roof so that it all lines up aesthetically. Now we've completed the installation of our Iron Ridge roof mount racking system. If you have any questions while going through this process, feel free to give us a call or stop by our website at wholesalesolar.com. My name's Jeremy Allen. I'll see you next time.